So we'd like to invite you to text a friend or two to join. No, just kidding. We'd like to invite you to step up to the front if you'd like. It's going to be kind of an intimate session. It might give you the appearance of a lecture, but because there's slides and people standing here, but really it's meant to be very much a workshop, a conversation. My name's Demian Szyld, and I really appreciate that you've joined, and got an amazing crew here to help facilitate the workshop. I truly hope it moves us all forward along our journeys in terms of feedback conversations. I'm very pleased to see folks coming in. What did we decide for introductions? Are we going around saying hello for everybody, or we're good with the bios are printed and folks know who you're working with? All right, awesome. We don't have any conflicts of interest, but I do take the view that everyone here is trying to improve, so you're going to be trying some new things. It's not going to be perfect. You're going to be giving and getting feedback, and we're all here with the intent to learn. And really, though we've done this workshop before, we're always trying to improve it, so we hope that you'll take the same view with us and be willing to help us see our own blind spots and ask us some interesting questions about the design. Really, our hope is by the end of the session, you're thinking more clearly about your thoughts on feedback and what it's like to give and get it, and why that's an interesting space to be in, where we can all grow and learn. I really mean it, all grow and learn, both learners and faculty. You'll have a little bit more of a window into using questions to facilitate that feedback conversation, and get into this idea of frame-based feedback, that there's a mental model or frame of reference worth investigating. So typically you would think of, who's excited when you hear, hey, I have some feedback for you? No, I'm the only one? Oh, nice, yes, good. At least 3 out of 20 people, excellent. We're in the 1%. Most of the time people are not excited about feedback because they think it's punitive or critical, but if we think of it as how can we think of it as a learning conversation? I think it's going to apply to clinical, academic, all kinds of professional aspects, even your leadership roles, and we're going to be focused on the micro skills of observation, advocacy, sharing your observation and point of view, inquiry, asking those crucial questions, and then listening, right? Like, we're going to do all this great work to set it up, but then we got to be able to make sure we take time to listen. We're not talking about disciplinary action, right? That's not a curious learning conversation. That's a time when you're working with a colleague, a trainee, somebody that reports to you, and it's not about learning. It's about saying, expectations, don't do it this way, that doesn't belong here. We're also not going to be talking about a really important topic that just belongs in other workshops, which is around building the educational alliance, building the context for feedback. It's important, and yet in our short time together, that's not going to be our focus. And another interesting topic that I'm still learning more about is feedback receptivity. Many times in these feedback workshops, people say, oh, well, but it all depends on the learner being ready to accept the feedback, and I agree. And also, it's not really in the domain of our conversation today. How's that sound so far? Feel free to bring up a question, a topic, a clarification. I would not see that as an interruption. I would see that as adding to our conversation. I know what I'm saying makes sense to me, but may not make perfect sense to you all. And my colleagues, of course, you have great ways of talking about this, so I do want to invite you to grab those other mics and help us here. Okay, so how are we doing this? We're going to do introductions and a warm-up right away. I'm hoping you're sitting close enough to pair up with someone you don't know or don't know too well. We're going to have a couple of activities. I've got a little bit of content to speed through and hopefully jog you with some interesting ideas, and then practice. I don't think we're going to do activity 3. I think we're going to just go 1 and 2. We'll see. If we're zooming through, we might do a third thing. So let's get to it. Pick a partner. Ideally someone you're not too familiar. You didn't train each other or work together, spend a decade in New York, so don't talk to each other. Share with each other your name, institution, and then something about feedback that you find either joyful or challenging. And then we're going to discuss as a group. It'll be challenge by choice. You don't have to share everything. Take 3 minutes. Okay, so let's start with the joyful. Anybody discover with your partner some aspects of feedback that you find really joyful that you're willing to share here?
The light bulb moment, when you see the light bulb. Well, the light bulb moment is when you're talking to them and you're giving them the feedback, and all of a sudden you see that their mind, it clicks in their mind, and they just start, the wheels start turning, and they get it. So that's joyful.
Awesome. So you see something in them that makes you think they're getting something new?
Thank you. That's a good one. I would say both. I think starting to teach has helped me receive feedback more, because when I started to teach people, like in medical school, as a resident, and they would get the answer wrong, they would beat themselves up, and they would start to feel really poorly about themselves for not knowing. I'm like, oh, I'm so stupid. But instead, like, getting them to reframe and say, you're not stupid, you are learning, right, has helped me shift my frame of reference and not beat myself up as much. And so to shift to more of a growth mindset has really helped both give and receive feedback.
So you like that feedback and leads to learning?
Absolutely.
Something I find joyful about feedback, especially being a trainee or learner, and then sometimes also being a teacher to students and younger residents, is getting over the nerves of it. And once I share whatever I'm feeling empathetically and just trying to be non-judgmental, that's a good feeling to just have that weight lifted, because everyone gets nervous giving and receiving feedback at some point. So I think that's really joyful doing that.
So getting over the barrier to entry and then just being in the moment. Any challenges?
Thank you. A couple of big challenges. I'm a program director, and I can speak for challenges in terms of faculty. Our faculty have voiced two major concerns. One is giving feedback. Our evaluations are not de-identified, so residents know exactly what our faculty are saying. So our faculty feel very concerned that there's negative repercussions to giving feedback, so they avoid it. And the second thing that I've heard about is, faculty, I think, develop friendships with emergency medicine is a little different than other specialties. We tend to develop friendships with our residents more than I think other specialties do. And faculty feel concerned that feedback will somehow damage that relationship they've worked so hard to kind of foster for months, if not years.
So feedback could make it poison that good feeling, or it could strengthen the relationship. And so how do you do more of what you want and less of what you don't? And what about the consequences to the feedback giver? So thanks for sharing that.
Hello.
Hi, Dan.
I think it's what you were saying we're not talking about today, but it's one of the biggest challenges is the person who's not in a space where they're able to receive it. And oftentimes, especially when you're in program leadership, you're in a position where they have to have the feedback regardless of sort of their readiness for it. And it just changes the entire interaction and I think the outcome of that feedback session, because they weren't in a place to get it. And then I think for a more broad thing, I think it takes a long time to get past the sort of the implications that you feel personally by giving someone negative feedback and them then just viewing you differently. And I hear it not infrequently from trainees where that particular attending gave me negative feedback, and now that's just like they're never going to get past that. They don't want to work with that person anymore. When sort of shifting this mindset that that's our job and we're here to help you grow and all that. So, but I think that is a deterrent to some people giving feedback.
And I said we wouldn't talk about feedback receptivity directly, but I think it does call our attention to thinking about what are we contributing as whether you're a peer, a junior resident of medical students, or at any level, how are we contributing to their readiness to be in the conversation? Because I think there might be something there as well. We'll take one more.
Well, just to piggyback off, I guess, the readiness to receive it, something I've learned, especially working in psych and precepting students, is that one day someone might be really ready to receive it and be really great receiving the feedback because they didn't necessarily have a lot of stress going on at home, or their mental health is great that day. Or the next day they might have had just a very overwhelming day or seen something traumatic with a patient or things like that, and they don't receive the feedback well at all. So if you're not doing feedback often and you catch them on that bad day, you just might come to the conclusion, oh, they're not going to receive feedback well, and then not want to give feedback more when that just might be one day. And I think we're all like that. One day we'll receive feedback very well, and the next we won't. And I think that's also something to keep in mind. The more often you do it, the more you'll see that there's going to be good days and bad days for everyone receiving it.
Absolutely, and the researchers would call that like multiple observations increase reliability and all those things, and it makes sense. Also, I think, what the topic might be, how, whether you're ready for a variety of contextual reasons inside or outside of work. So let's start working on some of our micro skills, and let's first start with the first step, which I think is observation, right? Like you want to be able to do feedback around some concrete experience that you have access to. So let me tell you a little story from back when I worked in New York. There's some New Yorkers here, so now I'm in Boston. I can say like the trauma in New York is just like not good, right? Like fall from height, if it's too high, you never make it to the hospital. There's not a lot of high-speed vehicles, but this is a problem when people fall into the subway and they call you, they say they're coming in, multiple amputations, tourniquet in place. It's going to be a mess, right? So we got this patient really like handled, packaged to CT, to the ICU. It's a really tragic situation and another life saved. And this is what the room looked like at the end of the resuscitation. So what I'd like to ask you to do here, I'm only showing you this moment in the resuscitation, but I'd like to ask you to use your observation skills to think about what you see. Describe with a partner, working still with your partner here, what do you see? What's the state of the room? What does it inform about the resuscitation that just ensued? What can you infer? How do you think that went based on what you're seeing here? So work with a partner and process this from your emergency medicine point of view. Take a few minutes to look at that, and I'll come around and ask you again.
Yeah, so one of the things I'd be concerned about, I said you did a great job, the patient's in the OR, they're getting their care that they need, but you need to be mindful of your staff, and you need to be mindful that you have another patient coming, you just don't know when. So that needle that's laying behind the blood pressure cuff would be a concern. The central line that's laying around on the floor. There's another box of needles that's not where it's supposed to be. So I'd be concerned that if you lose a staff member, then you're down a resource. That makes it tough to turn over the room. On top of it, your cleaning staff has to come in, and they have to be able to safely turn over the room. So there's a couple of team dynamics I would like to put into that conversation.
Great, and thank you for sharing. And first we heard the kind of overall assessment, and then lots of different pieces of what you're seeing, the needle here, the stuff there, no blood. There's an element of the successful outcome, and then back to a few other areas around teamwork and how we could watch out for each other. Thank you for sharing those. Let's get a couple others. What else do people talk about in seeing this? He covered it all?
We're going to volunteer people if we know that.
Yes, you can volunteer or volunteer your friend. I love the multiple perspectives from different points of view. Oh, awesome. Say your name and what your role is in your institution.
I'm Sonia. I'm a medical student still.
Woohoo.
I guess we were kind of imagining what that situation would be like during the moment, and we were saying it was probably chaotic and maybe like hard to communicate due to like all the mess on the ground. And like we would imagine this is a really big team and there were a lot of people working on that one patient together. So.
Yeah, so it is a possibility that it was chaotic, meaning really loud and lots of different commands, but it is also a possibility that it was quite quiet and still lots of things ended up on the ground. So there's a lot of things we know and a lot of things we don't know. In this case, we weren't there. When I find myself in our resuscitation room, I know that my attention is drawn to some things and not to others. So in a way, I have to remember, I actually probably didn't see it all. There's a lot of things I'm assuming here. And I think that's one key thing for us is to understand that there's a difference between what we can observe and what we think about it. And this normal, natural process that our brains are extremely adept to do is when you hear a little ruffling sound in the jungle and you say, tiger, right? We are evolved to make that assumption, to make that leap up the ladder of inference for our own evolutionary safety. But as educators and people in feedback courses, we need to walk ourselves down from because we see the observable data and there's a lot of it. We then select and pay some attention to it, and then we give it meaning, chaos. Chaos is bad. That means bad teamwork. That means not organized, not calm, not self-confident. So we go up this ladder of inference. We need to walk ourselves down and say, what do we see here that makes us think of that? So our perspective, our assessment, our judgments, our feelings, our viewpoints are not the observation. Another example would be to say, we didn't start this workshop late. It was 3:32. Okay, it was scheduled at 3:30. We started at 3:32 once everyone was in the room already. Late is our judgment of that. So to have a few words on feedback, I think feedback can mean a lot of different things. I'd love to have one of those mics back so I don't have to be stuck back here. I think what's cool about feedback is that it can mean so many different things. One transformative view for me is that feedback is everywhere. This is a picture from Philadelphia. Do you guys know what's happening here? This is feedback on the parking skills. You could get it as a ticket, or if there's an emergency, this is actually standard practice to put the fire hose through the car when you have to fight a fire. So really, anytime you walk, I think I walk into any room, the way people greet you, who's congregating with whom, like that is feedback, right? Who's inviting you to work on projects, how you get selected for certain opportunities. So feedback can be there. One of the interesting papers recently is around when you call a consultant, we all call consultants, the way they treat you on the phone, the kind of questions they're asking you, that's possibly feedback on how you call, the data you presented in the page, how the time of day, etc. So feedback is everywhere. I went back in the literature to one of the first papers, the classic paper on feedback, that's Jack Endy, 1983, Feedback in Clinical Medicine. And if you go back, I think the principles there are really, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Who would not want to subscribe to this? Okay, here, let's read them together because they're just so, I think, inspiring. They're kind of aspirational, so let's see what this looks like. Teacher and trainee working together as allies. Common goals. So that's a pretty good reminder. How are we going to execute on that? We'll talk about that. Well-timed and expected. People are going to be variable in their ability to receive it. Getting it regularly really helps. Based on first-hand data, the observable skill. I don't like, we don't want to be talking about hearsay. Sometimes you might have to, right? Like, I've received 4 emails about this. I want to talk to you about that. That's secondhand, but at least it's concrete. Regulated in quantity, because you may not be ready to hear about all the different aspects of that resuscitation. Why don't we focus on one important thing? I think that's good advice. Limited to the behaviors that you can actually change. They use the word remediable. It's a little judgy in my view. But let's say, that things that you can't change about yourself, we should not be trying to give feedback on. Descriptive, non-evaluative language. We talked a little bit about that. We'll get to some specifics. Performance, not generalization. So you're not a bad learner. Let's talk about today. What this episode was about. Or let's talk about this week-long rotation. But there's a lot of subjectivity, and subjectivity is good. And so I want to describe some subjective things. I'm going to say that they are. So I was feeling really worried when we were waiting for the patient to arrive, and I hadn't heard roles being assigned. It was my worry. I'm just going to label it at that, as opposed to saying it's wrong not to do that. Deal with decisions and actions rather than assumed intentions, right? So I don't know why you stood at the head of the bed and said, I'm Demian, I'm going to be the team leader for this one, but I need your help. I don't know why you said that. I'd love to know your intention behind that, okay? Intention would be an assumption, not an observation. So in that paper, we got a couple of kind of what I would say kind of classic definitions. What I'm going to do now is give you a couple of definitions of feedback to make it even more concrete, but also to show us the way the definition has been evolving, I think in a really positive way. So it's a little like tour through the last couple of decades in feedback. So same paper, Jack, and the feedback is the control of a system by reinserting into the same system results of the performance. So patient lived, results of the performance, you feel good. Next time you're going to keep up some of those activities. Alive to the OR, alive to the ICU, less bounce backs, lots of examples there. Without feedback, we can't expect things to either get better or even good things to be sustained. And so I can agree to, I don't like the control aspect of the definition, but I think it's reasonable. How are people reacting to that definition? What? Just because the outcome is good doesn't mean the process is. Yep.
Anybody get that? So was it a right, correct thinking in doing that action just because we had a good outcome? It's like bad drivers are reinforced all the time just because they don't crash, right? And so, or people who don't wear their seatbelt, maybe they don't die, but it's like, is that right? Were we right to put that chest tube in or intubate that person just because they made it to the ICU?
Awesome, great. From the group in Holland, I think one of the most sophisticated medical education groups up in Maastricht, the definition got a little more clarified. Specific information about the comparison of a trainee's performance to the expected standard. So what's your name? Ethan, and you're a? Awesome, so resident. So Kuya's, I think, excellent point is, I think it coming out in this definition that the comparison between the performance and an expected standard. So like, yeah, the outcome's good, but was I supposed to do that? Should we have done it? Should we have intubated earlier? Should we have done it at all? And always with the intent to improve, right? Like, we're not just saying it for other reasons, make people feel bad, motivate them. That's not the point of feedback. Telio and colleagues, I think, like kind of even more modern, and this is the group that does the educational alliance side of the feedback, I think really starts to get into this idea of co-construction of knowledge, really gets us into a practical approach to the learning conversation where the purpose of feedback is to learn, to change, and it's for both entities, everybody involved. And the faculty, the instructor, as we were talking about, they are bringing the standard in a lot of cases. What they're there to learn is about the trainee and their needs, and also about their thinking patterns, because you can get the right result for the wrong reasons. And so some of the words that I really like there are information exchange, so that's still there, that's based on the data. the authentic, committed educational relationship, that's at the center, and that gets to some of our challenges that we were talking about, the social dynamic between in the community of learning, and that there's a shared understanding where you're not just learning about what you did, but also what's expected, and also what went into it. I think a couple of things that are typical in feedback conversations is that, as we said, we may know, we tell people what they should do, and then they still don't do it, right? I see a couple of people nodding. So that's a limitation, and in part it's because we don't have that window into the whys. You did it that way, do it this way. That's coaching, that's good, that can be helpful. We don't want to take that away because it has its time and place, but it gives us a window into thinking that there might be opportunities. Sometimes in order to preserve that relationship, as we talked about, we try to get the receiver to say what they did wrong so we don't have to be the ones to say it to them directly. And we use a strategy that we shorthand GWIT, guess what I'm thinking. Anybody been an experienced or receiver of this? Yeah, and it can work, but it takes a long time. It can also be kind of like, feel kind of weird. Would you be willing to share? I see you nodding a couple. Would you be willing to share your experience of this?
I don't remember specific experiences. Yeah, I don't remember specific experiences, but again, like as a learner, it's hard when your preceptor or your teacher in the scenario isn't fully authentic and like open with what they want to share with you. So I feel like sometimes I have to play a guessing game, and like I don't know what I did wrong per se. And also, I mean, just personally, I don't want to admit things that I think I did wrong to my teacher. That doesn't feel great, right? So it's not like incentivizing to help me like be open myself. So being open first like helps learners also be open with you too.
So this might sound like, and what's the most important thing that you would have checked before discharging the patient? And you're like, well, I checked all these things, but like I don't know what you're thinking is the most important. And wouldn't it just be easier if you just told me what you're thinking? So I think also there's a thing around like trust gets eroded in a way by not saying, like why can't you tell me directly? Do you think I'm gonna melt down? Like, do you think I'm not here to learn? Like, what is this all about? Why are we uneasy?
About, the questions, because we all do this a lot, and it usually has a lot, well, I mean, some of it is the Socratic method thing that we were all taught, don't just tell them, have them work through it, et cetera. Some of it is that, and some of it is really, as people were saying before, our own discomfort with giving the feedback, and so we don't just want to say it, and so we're sort of trying to get, the trainee or whoever we're giving feedback to get there themselves. And what's funny about that is, in addition to the being, time inefficient, when you start watching this, it's, like really observing these kinds of things, it really starts driving you crazy. And it's also driving the person receiving the feedback crazy a lot of the time, right? It's like, can't they just tell me what it is they're thinking because I can't get there? So it's pretty funny, just start observing, sort of feedback conversations that you're getting or that you're involved with, and there's a lot of that happens.
And because we want to get to the conversation. So based on the work at the Center for Medical Simulation, which is a debriefing instruction center, they've crystallized this good judgment approach and have done different things with it, but we've applied it to feedback, and it has a mindset that's a little bit different. So you enter the feedback not with that certainty and judgment that something was right or was wrong, but with the curiosity of why it happened. And that's what you're there as the feedback initiator to learn. And you're going to co-construct knowledge based on the learner's perspective, and you're going to share yours too. So that's the mindset. The actions are to explore the whys, to uncover the frames of reference, and stop saying, let's give some feedback, to let's have a learning conversation. And the reasons we've talked about, we can see the actions and the results, and we could give feedback about what was done and what the impact was, but we have the opportunity to get into the whys, the frames, the thought process, the critical thinking, the knowledge base, potentially, although that's frequently not the missing piece. It's the context, the situational awareness, the priorities, and a prior experience that are really leading. And so we want to enter at that double loop. And how do we do that? So first, let me just reward you, because you've been working so hard, with a really quick video, a funny video for a second, to see, like, if we ask to start a feedback conversation, we're likely to learn. So if you've seen this, I'm sorry. If you don't speak Italian, don't worry, it's subtitled.
Scusi, buon uomo? Mi sa dire l'ora, per favore? Le 5:35.
This is that brilliant intern working in some different way, and you're like, huh?
E 36. Grazie. Prego. Ha mangiato il ciuchino, eh? No. Senta, mi sa dire che ore sono adesso? Allora. Le 7:15. Oh, ma sono le 7:15 spaccate. Incredibile. Ma lei come fa a leggere l'ora nelle palle del ciuchino, scusi? No, io le alzo. Sotto c'è il campanile, vedi? Già vedi. 7:15.
So in the good judgment approach, we take that view that people are intendedly rational. The thing that looks not right to you or really brilliant to you has a reason. They're acting in a way, it comes similarly in the just culture, people don't come to work to make errors or to harm patients. There's reasons why they're doing it, and our job is to be that detective and find out why. So we have to observe, explore those frames using preview, advocacy, inquiry, and listening, and then based on what we hear, discuss, teach, co-construct, tailor the learning, because nothing more frustrating than teaching, being taught the thing you already know, right? That doesn't help anybody. So we have a handout, and so I'll just make sure that you all have one. If you don't have one, raise your hand and we'll bring you one. But the protocol goes like this. You want to set a charter for the conversation with a preview, and you want to get to that almost like informed consent. Like, I'd like to talk about the decision to intubate. Is this an okay time? Thinking about, like, is this a good time to have this conversation? It doesn't have the judgment in it. Like, I want to talk about how you shouldn't have intubated. That's judgy. I want to talk about intubation. Then describe what you saw. I saw an agitated patient. They got treated for alcohol withdrawal, but they were desatting. They had 100% non-rebreather. There was 45 minutes to a handoff, and then eventually, after they vomited, they got intubated. That's all observable. It's in the record. Then your point of view. Remember, separating observation from point of view. I'm thinking there were several signals that could have led to an earlier intubation, and that might have prevented really the risk of aspiration, which now they've vomited, it made it a little more difficult. Wonder what your thoughts were at the time. So then turning it back to them to explore based on what you saw and what you think, what was their perspective? And then listening, right? So, well, I wanted to give them a chance. Last week I intubated somebody, but I really kept wondering whether they might have gotten better. I really wanted to give them a chance. Even though they were agitated, they did sedate pretty easily, and then they were arousable. I really didn't expect them to vomit. Okay, now I understand where they were coming from, and I can meet them for the rest of that conversation. So on your handout, you have a long version, the black and white side, and then a short version, which is the simple one. So to decrease your cognitive load, you can just look at the simple one for now, and later at home you can kind of look a little further. But we're going to practice going through this stepwise approach of preview the topic, say what you saw, say what you think about it, and then ask what was the driver of the behavior. So this Hopefully it's clear enough to try it. You don't have to fully understand it. I just want to get you to try it. But I'd love to take a clarifying question or two before we practice. Derek, some wisdom. Do you want? Can we give you a mic?
It's probably a little bit better. I just want to underscore a really important point, or sort of reframe this in a way that might be more or differently kind of digestible to everyone. So when we think about the introduction of a paper, it sets up the knowledge gap. And I think that often when we're trying to give feedback or have a feedback conversation, we will say something about what we observe, but we have some assumption in it, as opposed to first understanding what is the knowledge gap. And that's where the I saw, I think, and how did you see it? That's where that introducing questions into our feedback makes it so that our learners end up hearing what we think and why it's important, but it also helps us target and give them focused feedback that's applicable and relevant to where their minds are in the moment, as opposed to where we think their minds might be. And that's how it sort of connects to the ladder that we looked at in one of the earlier slides. So I think a lot about the introduction to a paper, what is the knowledge gap? We often are given feedback without really understanding it. That's where asking questions, I think, is part of this conversation, can be really, really helpful and enlightening.
And unlike in the paper where you're like stating truths, here by owning this perspective, I saw, I think, it invites the discrepancy, the discussion, where like you're not laying down the truth, you're just saying your point of view, inviting them into the conversation. Okay, so work in pairs or trios. The faculty will come around and help you out. I'm gonna show you a very quick video. You're gonna meet Tony Ansell, one of our superstar nurses, Jack Minuti, one of the fellows inserting a central line. You're going to see them, the physician is going to contaminate the field as they're inserting the central line. The nurse is going to come try to help and speak up in a certain way, and then you could choose who you want to give feedback. You could give feedback to either one about their performance. Okay? I'll try to show you. So take a look. And then we'll practice.
Dr. Mead, do you need any more help? No, I'm good, Tony. Mr. Davis, stay still, okay?
Adjusting the glasses with the
Dr. Mead, do you
barrel
want
of
me to get you another one of them? No, I don't need anything. Tony, what are you doing? I didn't ask for anything. Just, Tony, did you check on that tetanus in Bay 4? I'll go check on it.
And Tony,
Mr. Davis, now stay still.
and Tony gives a new syringe and says, do you need any help? As opposed to saying, you contaminated yourself. I think that's not sterile. And so you now have the standards to which to compare the performance. Pair up and try this out. The faculty will come around and try to help you out. Get it started. This is the time we have to start wrapping up. I never like this. I would like to start closing by getting just a few closing comments and reactions. You've gotten a chance to talk about feedback, joys and challenges. We went through some ideas around feedback and some structures, and you get to try it out. So I'd love to hear your light bulb moments, ahas, new ideas, things you might try in the future. So love to get a couple comments before we wrap up.
Ernesto Romo at Washington University with Alex, and I think one of the things that I think are important about feedback is the normalization of it and the creation of growth mindset. So really creating a culture at your institutions where feedback, we obviously have to give feedback, but as our colleague back there who's a program director described, it's very challenging. But the more that we normalize it, create the expectation that at every shift, you're going to have a discussion with your attendings on this. And Alex, who's here, and Aaron Lacey, who was also here earlier, they're new faculty, but as new faculty, they have come with that mindset. And so on every shift, you'll see them pull the residents afterwards and say, hey, here's what you did well, here's what I think, you know, you could improve on. And so I think for us as educators, we just have to, you know, we're all overworked right now probably, and just saying, you know, on every shift, I'm gonna make an effort to do this so that I don't only do this when I see negative things that I know I can't allow my learner to walk away not having a corrective measure. And so that way it's just more palatable.
Absolutely, I love that, and I think that was one of the answers I was going to say, is that we're not really, I mean, I think we've come a long way, but we're not, as faculty, taught how to give feedback well. Our culture is not one of, you know, having feedback, well, I mean, it can be, right, but really to be coaching to get that learner or whoever it may be to where we want them to be. I think if you create that, then the feedback conversations and are normalized and are much easier to have. And I just wanted to add one more thing to what you're saying, which I think you can also start the feedback conversation at the beginning of the shift. And this is something, you know, because I live in sim world and I debrief, you know, every day pretty much, and we pre-brief everything. I start all my shifts, and the first time I did this, I got looked at like I had 3 heads with my residents after we do, you know, sign-outs, et cetera, and I say, so, you know, I don't work a lot clinically, so sometimes I'm introducing myself, and I have medical students introduce myself, you know, who's everybody on the team, and then I say, so here's what you can expect of me today. We're obviously, you know, in an environment that's patient care, so that has to be first, but I really care about your education, where you're at. I want you to tell me something that you want to learn today, a gap that you feel you have, either procedurally or what have you, and then this is what's going to happen related to the feedback, right? So setting expectations, knowing that you're there to teach them, that you're going to give them, you know, all of that really helps, so when you have those conversations at the end of the shift or in the middle of the shift, right? So it's a continuous conversation.
And just to add a layer to that, so I love at the start of the shift saying to people, I'm going to give you feedback whether you like it or not, because it is my job to make you better, and that's why we're here. Taking some of the language that Demian used. And if you get in the habit of doing it, first of all, it holds us to it as educators. We have to do it now. We promised them they're going to do it, so they're waiting for it. But I make it a contract. There's nothing in writing, but I don't want to give them feedback on just what's important to me, because if we go back to, and I asked Damian to bring this back up, you know, for our ladder of influence, 3, 4 down, I'm going to give a learner feedback on what I think is important, based on my value. And though as the attending, I do think what I think is important and my values matter, I also need to meet people in the middle, otherwise the feedback won't be sticky, it won't turn into future growth. And so the reason why I really try to ask about a plan for feedback at the beginning and get a sense of what the resident wants me to give them feedback on, it's so that way my observations are really focused on what they think they need to be working on as well. And I found most of our residents kind of know by PGY2 and onward. They've gotten some feedback on something, and the more they're used to working with this and working on it with me, they'll just tell me, this is what I've been getting evaluations on or feedback on. And it helps prime my feedback and my observations on shift, so that way, when I'm on hour 6 and I'm hungry and I'm tired, I'm not going to notice just what's important to me based on my feelings and be at the top of the ladder. I'm actually staying at the bottom, trying to observe a behavior that's related to what they're working on. And don't get me wrong, there's still things that I think are important. I'm going to layer that in, but it helps me at least make sure on shift I'm working at the bottom of the ladder on what's objective and important to the resident, and not something else, which is hard to do on hour 6, 7, 8 when you're
There's
hungry.
2 things that are also happening in that little snippet. One is in terms of feedback receptivity. Once they say what they want to talk about, it becomes invited feedback as opposed to uninvited, much better, like vampires, right? They can't come into your house. The other thing it does is it changes the power dynamic, because the topic selection is a big source of power in debriefing conversations. And I said there's feedback everywhere. Like my amazing colleagues adding things at the end is feedback to me that I need to put that at the beginning. I'm eternally grateful for your clarifying. Really to you all for coming. If you want to read a little more about it, I had a QR code there for a recent paper we're super proud of on how to use the with good judgment method in different areas. And thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Don't miss the opening session.